let's dive into the story of a man named Uzziah, a king in ancient Judah. His life is, well, it's a wild ride. A perfect example of reaching incredible heights and then experiencing a fall that is just catastrophic. For about 50 years, this guy was the gold standard. He was strong, he was innovative, and it seemed like everything he touched turned to gold. But as you can probably guess, there's a massive twist coming. And this is how his story ends. I mean, think about that. After decades on the throne, famous across the ancient world, his entire legacy gets boiled down to this one brutal final line. So how on earth does that happen? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together today.
So that's the big question, right? How does a king who has everything, we're talking power, wealth, a massive army, a long and stable reign, how does he end up as a complete and total outcast? Well, to figure that out, we have to go all the way back to the beginning.
Before the fall, there was the rise. And honestly, what a rise it was. Uzziah's story doesn't start with disaster. It kicks off with a true golden age of power, and it all began when he was just a teenager. 52 years. Just let that number sink in for a second. He becomes king at 16 years old and holds on to the throne for over half a century. You gotta remember, in an era of constant chaos and turmoil, that kind of stability wasn't just impressive, it was practically unheard of. And he wasn't just sitting around either. The guy was a brilliant military strategist, taking down longtime enemies like the Philistines. Not only that, he was an architect, building up Jerusalem with new fortifications. He was an innovator, creating what might have been some of the world's first catapults. And on top of all that, he was grounded. He had a real passion for agriculture because, as the text says, he loved the soil. He had this huge army at his command, and his fame spread all the way to Egypt. He was a superstar. And right here, in the middle of listing all his incredible successes, we get this little phrase that feels like a record scratch. He was marvelously helped till he became strong. That one little word, till, it changes everything. It's the moment the whole story pivots, basically telling us that the very strength he worked so hard to get was about to become his own undoing. And this brings us right to the heart of the tragedy, what you might call the peril of prosperity. It turns out that for Uzziah, handling success was way harder than handling any of his enemies. His strength, the very thing he'd built his entire kingdom on, became a fatal trap. And look at how clearly the source spells it out for us. This wasn't a political coup, it wasn't a foreign invasion. The text is crystal clear. His heart was lifted up to his destruction. The real enemy wasn't outside the city gates, it was inside his own head. All that strength had curdled into a deadly pride. Okay, so to really get what he did next, you need this one crucial piece of context. In ancient Judah, there was a very strict separation of powers. The king had all the civil authority, right? But the religious authority, that belonged only to the priests. They were the only ones who could perform sacred duties inside the temple, like burning incense. This wasn't just a tradition, it was considered divine law, a line you just did not cross. You can almost see his fall happening in slow motion, in 4 clear steps. First, he becomes strong. Second, that strength turns into pride, into arrogance. Third, that pride convinces him that he's above the rules, that he can do whatever he wants. And finally, he acts on it. He walks right into the temple to do a job that was never his to do. And this all leads us to the explosive climax of the story. We're now inside the sacred temple, a holy place that Uzziah, completely full of his own power and importance, is about to violate in a major way. And he actually goes through with it. This isn't just a passing thought, he's really doing it. Can you just imagine the arrogance? The most powerful man in the kingdom, striding into the most holy place on earth to perform a sacred ritual that is absolutely forbidden to him. He genuinely believes his power has no limits. But here's the thing, he wasn't alone. The high priest, a guy named Azariah, and 80 other priests, who are described as valiant men, stood up to him. I mean, think about the sheer courage that must have taken to stand in the way of a powerful, popular, and now incredibly arrogant king, and to tell him no. And they didn't beat around the bush. They confronted him head-on, reminding him of his place and of God's law. They told him, point blank, this is not your job, and what you're doing is wrong. This was his last chance, his final off-ramp to turn back. But his pride just wouldn't let him back down. When he was confronted with the truth, Uzziah didn't repent. He got furious. His heart, already puffed up with pride, now just boiled over with rage at being challenged.
And right there, in that exact moment of white-hot anger, judgment falls. And it's instant, it's visible, and it's horrifying. Leprosy, the ultimate sign of being an outcast, just erupts on his forehead. His own rage is met with divine fire, and the consequence is immediate and totally irreversible.
So from this moment on, everything was different. That one single act of prideful rage completely redefined his life, his reign, and his entire legacy. The Golden Age was officially over. And the punishment was for life. Leprosy back then was basically a living death. He was stripped of his public duties, he was stripped of his power. The king who once commanded armies was now a total outcast, forced to live in isolation. And the contrast between his two lives is just devastating. The king who commanded 300,000 soldiers was now stuck in an isolated house. The ruler whose fame reached all the way to Egypt couldn't even set foot in his own city's temple. He built towers to protect his capital, but in the end, he was buried in a separate field away from all the other kings. His fall wasn't just partial, it was absolute.
This whole story serves as this timeless warning, and the source material really drives it home with this quote. The point is that the biggest spiritual falls often happen, not when we're young and dumb, but after a lifetime of success. The real danger zone is when we start believing our own hype, when we think we're too smart or too strong or too successful to fail. Which really leaves us with this final, powerful question to think about. Uzziah handled adversity beautifully when he was young, but he was completely destroyed by his own success later in life. It really makes you wonder, for our character, for our humility, and for our ultimate legacy, which one is actually the greater danger? Is it failure? Or is it getting everything we ever wanted?